آزادی بیان،
言论自由、
free speech.
I've been working on the philosophy and ethics of information for some time. These are new areas of research. The contribution that they can make, broadly speaking, are significant for the following reason, and I'm trying to simplify. At a stage where fundamental issues are in contrast, in this particular case we have two fundamental rights, the freedom of speech and privacy. What we need to be able to do is to use concepts in a clear, accurate, but also imaginative way. I like to define that as conceptual design. Now, conceptual design is what we do every day when we decide whether to have a party on Saturday or not, whether we are planning for a particular holiday, and these are, as it were, everyday simple instances of philosophy. Or we do it at the highest possible level. Now, political decisions, religious debates, ethical questions. Should I get married to that particular person? What job do I want to have in the future? Now, these things that are full of consequences. Now, when it comes to the European debate and the debate on the right to be forgotten, for example, and the clash between these two fundamental rights, what we need is, of course, a lot of understanding in terms of legislation, business, rules that are ongoing, but also some serious conceptual design. And that's where philosophy comes in. Of course, we need what I like to call a philosophy of our time, for our time, which means that a new philosophy, and that's what the philosophy of information tries to do. A premise before answering that limit is a moving target. We need to realize that where we put the limit to freedom of speech is not something that is written in stone once and for all. It will be silly, not because it's relative. That would be the other mistake. No, we shouldn't swing from one extreme of the pendulum to the other extreme. It's not absolute, it's not fixed in stones, but it's not, oh, it depends and anything goes and we can be as flexible as you like. No, it has to be relationally significant given the time and the culture and the technological developments and the economy in which we live. So given a particular context, that context supports a particular kind of freedom of speech. Change the context and so does the freedom of speech. With an analogy, is a tango. The two, society and freedom of speech, they tango together. It's not like freedom of speech is fixed and then society has to adapt through the centuries. Now, with that premise in place, I think that we are seeing today the need for a defense of freedom of speech to an extent that is within the boundaries of the legality. It sounds trivial, and perhaps it is. What is legal means that we should defend people's right to exchange and access information when the information in question has been declared legally fine. So, of course, one cannot defend pornography, child pornography, through a freedom of speech perspective. The trouble occurs when, for example, a newspaper has published in perfect legality, and that's why it's contextual, within their society, within our time. Today, we all accept that, say, a daily newspaper publishes something, and then we are told, oh, but the access to that something should be restricted, should be forbidden. Now, this, of course, has a counterpart. Now, freedom of speech, of course, has a difficult relationship to privacy, but it also has a different relationship with closure. Especially in our country, we know what it means to be subject to an endless, painful reminding of terrorist acts, violence that we've done to each other. And closure is a way of remembering without recalling. You don't forget, but you don't constantly recall those memories. Now, that closure happens when freedom of speech is exercised intelligently. That's why, ideally, and then again, it's a philosopher talking, so in the best of all possible world, the kind of a regulative ideal we should have in the long run is that freedom of speech should be defended 100%, exercised a little bit less. In other words, what has happened in Paris, for example, with the cartoons and so on, I find that an excessive use of freedom of speech. Freedom of speech should also be something that I can have defended without the need to exercise it to its full length. It's like, again, legal weapons. If they are legal, it doesn't mean that I have a right to use them every time, anytime. So freedom of speech is a very, very powerful weapon that we have in our hands. We should be careful how we use it, which doesn't mean that we need to restrict its use. It's the responsibility of those who have the freedom of speech not to overuse it. I think today we see that the legal context is increasingly shaped by a variety of forces. Pressure groups, nation states, of course, but also supranational institutions, the European Union, the European Commission, international agreements. Think of the trade agreements, transatlantic agreements. Today we have, as we speak, literally these hours, we have this discussion about the safe harbor. So it was always the case that nation states were a player in a more complex game. The difference now is that they are a less significant player than they used to be. It's as if we had a game with a lot of variables, and the major big players were nation states, just even until past generation. Today we see that, say, something like the Greek crisis, for example, shows that there's a lot of other institutions that have a saying. This happens also at the legal level. So the new data protection regulation, when we will know exactly what the text is, because it's still being refined, so it's always difficult to say what it will look like. It's a bit of a cake in the making. You can't judge until the very last moment when you taste it. But so far, the making has been very laborious. There's a risk and a hope. I think the risk is that we might end up over legislating about a number of fundamental rights that they're difficult to capture. So the more we try to frame them in a fixed way, the easier it becomes to say, well, since this was not said, therefore it's allowed. It's like a context in which you have more and more and more rules in order to make sure that everybody play according to the rules. The more rules you play, the easier it is to appeal to the absence of the strange rule, the loophole. In a context where everybody has to play reasonably, and we know what we mean by reasonably, well, there is no, as it were, way of appealing to the external lack of a rule. So, but that's a different perspective from continental Europe to the more Anglo-Saxon view, where pragmatism and traditions play a bigger role. So that's one risk, over-legislating on fundamental principles and rights. There's also hope, and the hope is that finally we'll have some clarity, some rules which we may or may not like, but at least we know the rules. Now, so far we've been playing with a game that is modifying the rules as we play. It's not unclear who really has the last saying. Nation states, Europe, European Commission, Article 29, companies. It's a bit of an odd mix. At some point, there will be a European general framework, and if we don't like it, we will change it. So the appointment to the ethics advisor group is very recent, just a matter of days, and which allows me to be rather vague. Not because I want to be vague, but because it is really work in progress. We haven't even met yet, and the broad all-encompassing remit is to provide ethical guidelines on the use and development of digital technologies in Europe, with a especially intense focus on data protection, and hence privacy, and human dignity, as per the European Charter of Human Rights. This is important because it's a different perspective from the one that you might get across the Atlantic. The view is that the debate on privacy should be grounded on fundamental human rights, and in particular on human dignity, and how we can see this being a coherent framework within which the digital technologies can develop and flourish. I think that freedom of speech is coming to a stage of maturity. I know we don't take long-term perspectives on these things sometimes, but if you look at how freedom of speech has developed along, not the years, the centuries, we know there has been a long fight, and a fight for the good, for something that we should, each of us, enjoy in full, with no fears from the state, from big corporate, from any sort of violent reaction. So we are lucky to live in a country that is at the forefront of freedom of speech. No matter how much we complain, this is a paradise compared to many other places in the world. Which means that we might be able to relax without sort of lowering our guard. A more relaxed approach to freedom of speech doesn't mean underestimating it or undervaluing. It means what I said a moment ago, having a more intelligent, reasonable exercise of a right, which one knows could exercise in full, but has a bit of restraint for other reasons, respect for other religious views, for example. That's on the one hand, but without lowering our guard, because the world is a nasty place. I mean, we tend to forget, but we just have to leave the British Islands, or indeed a bit of Europe, and even reach Europe a few kilometers away, where freedom of speech is no longer applied. And I'm talking about Turkey, I'm talking about Russia, and countries where freedom of speech is a dream. I mean, for which people pay with their lives. Now, that is something that we should be fighting for. And so instead of maybe thinking in terms of the highest risk, I would like to think in terms of the biggest hope, is that we Europeans can actually lead in the development of freedom of speech across the world. We have damaged this earth of ours to no end, we Europeans. We can pay back something. And one way of paying back is to pay back in terms of great lessons, precisely in terms of civilization. Freedom of speech is one of them.